Let's move on to the book of Numbers, and we will see the numbering, obviously, of the children of Israel as they are on their way to the promised land. The author of Numbers is Moses. And the key verses that we're going to look at are chapter 6, verses 24 and 24 to 26. Numbers 6, 24 to 26. A very familiar prayer. Maybe when you were in high school chorus, you might have learned this one. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face toward you and give you peace. So we'll use that as our memory verse, and you might be well ahead by knowing that already. The word Numbers, when you look at the book of Numbers, Numbers means, obviously, the numbering. It is the numbering of the people of Israel. One of the favorite Hebrew titles in Hebrew tradition is in the wilderness. They were in the wilderness. And so there's kind of a secondary title to it in the Hebrews, for the Hebrews. There are themes throughout the book of Numbers, themes that we'll see again and again. God's authority, the theme of his judgment, and the theme of faithfulness, what God demands of those who are going to follow him and be his. The book of Numbers can be broken down into three sections. We've done that. The older generation, chapters 1 to 14, the wandering years, chapters 15 to 20, and the new generation, chapters 21 to 36. So let's kind of break it down a little bit and look at the older generation. We see, first of all, the numbering in chapters 1 to 4, where God numbers the men who are able to go and fight. This deals with the outward formation of the camp. This is how the camp was to be outside of the tabernacle to protect it. The census was taken for a military purpose, for military purposes. God wanted the children of Israel to know how many fighting men they had. So, according to Numbers 2, verse 32, they took a census of everyone from 20 years of age and up who were able to fight and go to war. And the total census was 603,550 men. That's a pretty good sized army. 603,550. That would not include women or children all the way up to the age of 20. It wouldn't include them. And the elderly men who would not fight. And so there were some people who were exempt in the census. So this military campaign would be led by an army of 603,550. When the census was taken, the Levites were exempt. God didn't count the Levites for military purposes. He does count the Levites who had the main task of taking care of the tabernacle and all that went into the tabernacle, all that was a part of their worship. But the Levites were exempt from this particular census in chapter 2. But there was later a census in chapter 4 of the Levites, all those the Gershonites. You want to make sure you know who they are. The Gershonites, the Merarites, and the Kohathites, three of the tribes of Aaron and the Levites. And their families showed 8,550 men who were able to serve as Levites between the ages of 30 and 50. And so the Levites, the priests who were serving in the tabernacle, were between the ages of 30 and 50. And at the age of 50, they could retire from their daily service. Now, they continued on in special occasions. They would be there for the feast day celebrations, and all of those things were involved, but they would not serve regularly in the temple. So chapters 1 to 4 deal with the numbering. Chapters 5 to 10 deal with the instructing. This is where God gives instructions to the people, And that deals with the inward movement of the camp, the condition of the camp, how they were to take care of everything in the tabernacle, how they were to, when the cloud would rise during the day or the fire by night and they would move, you had to know who was responsible for folding up what. You had to know who was responsible for getting all the utensils that went with serving in the tabernacle, all the things of the altar and carrying the altar, all of the tabernacle curtains and the tent itself. You had to know who was going to pick those things up. And so that entire section, chapter 5 to 10, describes the holiness that was to be exemplified by all of Israel as they took special care of the tabernacle. And then chapters 10 through 14 deal with the movement of the camp. We call this the journeying. They were on their way to the promised land. They were on their way to the land of Canaan. How were they to move? Again, the pillar of cloud by day, the pillar of fire by night. The Lord said, whenever it comes, you move. Whenever it stops, you stop. And so this was how the older generation was instructed, chapters 1 to 14. Then we have chapters 15 to 20 we'll call the wandering years. The wandering years. This was kind of a period of transition, because as they wandered through the wilderness, a lot of things happened, and we're going to spend a little bit of time here. All the older generation died in the wilderness except for two. Anybody know who they are? Joshua and Caleb. Joshua and Caleb. You will remember that Joshua and Caleb were two of the 10 spies who went out to spy out the land. When they came back, 10 of them said, no, we can't do this. Joshua and Caleb said, yes, we can. We go in the power of the Lord, we can make it. So Joshua and Caleb were rewarded for their faithfulness. Chapter 15 gives you kind of an account of various laws that would be in force when they got to Canaan. And that's just a technical read in chapter 15. But chapters 16 to 18 deal with rebellion against God's leadership. There were several instances of rebellion against Moses and Aaron. But the first one was a rebellion led against Moses by Korah. By Korah, Korah, Korah. This is in chapter 16. Korah and his cohorts led a rebellion against Moses and Aaron. And I love the story in chapter 16. As you read through it, I'll give you a little easy paraphrase. Korah and his family said, we're going to rebel against Moses. There were a couple of others that went along with him. Moses said, look, according to the Lord said, Moses, you need to draw everybody out, call everybody to come. He even called Dathan and Abiram, who were two other men who were involved in this rebellion. He said, you need to come out of your tents and come before the Lord. Dathan and Abiram said, we're not coming. You can't make us. Nanner, nanner, nanner. We're not coming. And so Moses said, okay, we're calling you out. Korah and his whole family come outside the house. Moses said to the people, if these people die a natural death, you'll know that I'm not the leader that God has chosen and appointed. But he said, I love the way this goes. He said, if something strange happens, let's say the earth opens up and swallows them up and their houses and everything else, then you'll know that God has chosen me to lead. Well, we all know what happened. There was a great earthquake in chapter 16, verse 32, and Korah and his whole household and their house and everything with it were swallowed up by the earth. There were also 250 other people with Dathan and Abiram who were also killed as fire fell from heaven and devoured them. And so this was God simply saying, this is my leadership, follow him. You don't mess with God, as the scripture says, you don't touch God's anointed. And so this was the example of that. Now, look at chapter 16, because after all of that happened, I want you to see verse 41. After all of this happened, it says, but the next day, all the congregation of the sons of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The next day. I mean, if you see an earthquake take place and swallow up a family and their whole household, and you see fire come down from heaven and destroy 250 other people, you would think somebody's going to say, hey, we'd better behave ourselves. But no, instead, the next day, they grumbled against the Lord again, and 14,700 people died in a plague that was sent by God. This is a reminder to us that you just don't go against God's leadership. What God has ordained, what God has set apart. And so this was the lesson we learned from Korah and Dathan and Abiram and the children of Israel as they rebelled. In chapter 20, we read of Aaron's budding rod. And Aaron's budding rod was a symbol of God's, or a display of God's approval of his priesthood. This was saying to the people that Aaron is my appointed priest. He is the one who is set aside for that purpose. And Eleazar, his son, in chapter 20, succeeded him. In these wandering years, we come to an interesting account in chapter 20. After the death of Miriam, they came to the waters of Meribah, and the waters were they didn't have any water. They were looking for water, and so God said to Moses, "I want you to go and speak to the rock." It is here that we discover Moses' sin against the Lord, the sin that kept him out of the promised land. You remember, Moses didn't get to go into the promised land. He got to see it, but he didn't get to go in. And many people ask, well, what was Moses' sin? Well, let's look at chapter 20, and let's notice, particularly in verse 8, God says to Moses, take you and your brother, take the rod, assemble the congregation together, and speak to the rock before their eyes, that it may yield water. Well, we keep reading in verse 9. It says, so Moses took the rod from before the Lord, just as he had commanded him. Now, there are some people who speculate Moses' sin was he took the rod to strike the rock, but he was instructed to take the rod, so that can't be the sin. So in verse 10, Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together at the rock, and he said to them, listen now, you rebels. He called them rebels. Maybe that was his sin, calling the people of Israel. Maybe Moses' anger got the best of him, and he called them a bunch of rebels. But God had called them rebels, so that may not be the sin. He said, you rebels, shall we bring forth water out of this rock? Maybe that's it. We, Aaron and I, we're going to be the ones that provide this water for you. And so he's taking the glory of God for himself. But I really don't think that was it either. Verse 11, then Moses lifted up his hand and struck the rock twice. Maybe it was his anger, striking the rock twice instead of speaking to it. He was told to strike the rock. You'll remember that earlier in Exodus chapter 17, he was instructed to strike the rock then in Exodus. So it might not be that he struck the rock, or struck it in anger. But verse 12 gives us the answer. Verse 12, But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you have not believed me. They didn't trust the Lord. They didn't have enough faith in the Lord that they would even teach the children of Israel or remind Israel of all the times God had delivered them. I mean, they're grumbling about water. Why couldn't Moses and Aaron simply say, look, do you remember everything God has done for us? And so they didn't believe God. He didn't believe and trust in the Lord. And so that was his unbelief. His unbelief. He failed to remind the people of their past deliverances. And so this was the thing that kept him out of the land of promise. Well, their journey was delayed because of the sin of Edom. Edom, Edom. This is in chapter 20 again. You'll remember, I mean, not only because of their grumbling and the troubles they had at the waters and the rock and everything, and their grumbling against Moses' leadership, but there was the sin of Edom. They went to Edom and they asked, we want to pass through your land. We're not going to take any water. We're not going to take any of your fields. We're not going to take anything. We just want to pass through so our journey will be shortened. And the people of Edom, the king of Edom said, nope, you're not going to come. We're not going to allow you through here. And they even picked up weapons in order to prevent them, and they threatened them. So it was the sin of Edom that prolonged their journey even more. These were the wandering years. So that brings us to the third. You've got the older generation, the wandering years, and the third is the new generation. The new generation. We get to chapters 21 to 36 to talk about this new group of Israelites who come along. And we have this incident of the bronze serpent. Again, the people complained and grumbled against the Lord. And the bronze serpent teaches us the danger of complaining. The danger of complaining. They were at Hormah, which the name Hormah means destruction. So they are at a place of destruction, and people spoke against God and against Moses. And so there's all this grumbling, and God sent the fiery serpents among the people. And then finally they said, we've sinned, we've got all this, sickness because of the fiery serpents. There's got to be a way to be delivered. So God said, okay, Moses, take a stick and put a bronze snake on it, and whoever looks upon it will be healed. Which reminds us that deliverance is from God, but you have to respond. And you have to respond personally. You couldn't send Aunt Martha to go look at the snake for you. You had to go yourself and look at the snake. And so there's a parallel to the bronze serpent, by the way, in John chapter 3. In John 3, 14 and 15, Jesus is talking to Nicodemus and talking about how he himself is going to be lifted up. In John chapter, I've got it written down here somewhere. In John, I think it's 12. Jesus said, if I am lifted up, I will draw all men to myself. And so this is a picture of the serpent in the wilderness. Jesus is lifted up on the cross, crucified, and will draw all men to himself. So there's that parallel lesson. But the bronze serpent, and the issue there deals with complaining. But then in another chapter, we meet the false prophet Balaam. This is chapter 22. And the false prophet Balaam teaches us the danger of greed. The danger of greed. You'll probably remember the story. Balak is the king of the Amorites, and he calls for Balaam, who is a prophet of God, And he sends to him delegates who say, Balak wants you to come and put a curse on Israel. And at first, Balaam says, no, I can't do that. These are God's people. I can't do that. So he sends them away. Well, they come again. And Balaam says, well, maybe. So spend some time with me. I'll pray and ask the Lord. And the Lord said, okay, I want you to go, but you're only going to speak what I tell you to speak. And so he gets to Balak and he tells Balak, I can only speak what the Lord gives me to speak. I can't speak anything else. And so he goes up on the mountain, and instead of pronouncing a curse, he pronounces a blessing. Well, Balak is not thrilled. So he asks him again, okay, maybe there's another mountain. You can go on that one and you can present a curse. And Balaam says, I can only say what the Lord tells me to say. So he goes up there and he pronounces another blessing instead of a curse. And Balak is persistent. He said, let's try again. Well, Balaam this time, instead of seeking the Lord, he says, I know what to say that will please the Lord. And so he just goes up and spouts off of the top of his head instead of speaking what the Lord directed him to say. Then you meet his donkey, who talks to him, which is the amazing thing. Balaam's riding along, and the thing, stops right in the middle of the road, and he beats on it and goes a little further, and they're in a narrow place, and he bangs him up against the wall. So Balaam's leg is hurt, and he beats him some more, and he goes, and finally the man of the Lord, the warrior of the Lord, stands in the middle of the road, and the donkey just stops. And Balaam gets out and starts hitting and beating on him. What's wrong with you? And the donkey starts talking to him. And the amazing thing is, Balaam starts talking back. Just an amazing exchange. And the man who was standing there in the middle is often seen as the Lord himself. This is a pre-incarnation of the Lord in chapter 22. And so this is just God saying, look, you didn't listen to me. I'm going to get your attention, and I'm going to tell you what really is to be done. So the false prophet Balaam teaches us the dangers of greed. In this newer generation, we mentioned that Joshua and Caleb were the only two of the older generation who made it to the promised land. Moses' successor was Joshua. Joshua was the one. And we learn in the book of Joshua that the Lord said, be strong and courageous. And that is exactly what Joshua was. At the end of the 40 years of wandering, there was another census taken of the fighting men. And this time there were 601,730 men. That's a loss of about 2,000 men along the way. Added to them were 23,000 Levites as they were ready to enter the promised land. So if you account for women and children under the age of 20 and men over a fighting age, you could easily say that the population of Israel, as they were ready to enter into the promised land, was between 2.5 and 3 million people. That's quite a crowd to move into the promised land. This is the book of Leviticus, or Numbers, and it teaches us a lot. Now, I've given you a map there so you can see the layout of the tabernacle, where the families were to camp around the tabernacle. On the north, you had Dan, Asher, and Naphtali, and you had the Merarites. Those were the Levites, the Levitical family, on the north side. On the west, Ephraim, Manasseh, and Benjamin, along with the Gershonites. On the south, Reuben, Simeon, and Gad, with the Kohathites. And then on the east, you had Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun, as well as Moses with Aaron and his sons. Whenever the camp would move, this is the way they would set out. And we'll see how they would march in order as we continue on through the scriptures, but see how they marched in order and they followed this order. So you can see how the tabernacle is laid out. Notice, if you will, coming from the east, that's the right side of your page. When you come right inside the gate, you've got the altar, the burnt offerings. That's where those daily sacrifices would be given. You had the laver where they would wash the animal, wash the sacrifice. Then you would come into the holy place where you would have the tabernacle, the table of showbread, the golden lampstand, and the altar of incense right in front of the Holy of Holies, the altar of incense offering up a sweet smelling savor to the Lord at all times. And then inside the most holy place, the Holy of Holies, you had the ark with the mercy seat, with the cherubim, with their wings toward one another. They met in the middle, and their faces were looking down at the mercy seat. Just a beautiful sight of God's attention to the sacrifice that would be made, where propitiation would be made, where the covering was provided by God for his people. The book of Numbers. A few things to remember. I can give you 10, but I just want to hit a couple. Judah's tribe had the place of honor on the east side of the tabernacle. Whenever the children of Israel later on would go out to war, it was Judah who led the charge. The number of years of wandering, 40, for the same number of days that the spies searched out Canaan. Joshua and Caleb and the others were there for 40 days. We mentioned the angel of the Lord as a manifestation of the Lord. Chapter 32, verse 23, be sure your sin will find you out. You can't hide it. You can be sure that it will find you out. And then if you remember the cities of refuge, if there was someone who was involved in a fight and he accidentally killed a man, he could flee to the city of refuge and he would stay there until the death of the high priest. And he could stay there protected. The family would not be able to avenge the death of the one that had been killed, but he was protected, the cities of refuge. That's the book of Numbers. Lots of interesting accounts in there. And we get lots of information concerning how the people of Israel moved and lived.